A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Good day, rambunctious rebels, I'm Unsilent, and for over 45 years people have been building upon the universe created by George Lucas in Star Wars. Those stories are part of what we know as the Star Wars Expanded Universe, containing novels, comics, movies, TV shows, and even video games. The focus of today's video played in the Star Wars sandbox, but was never officially completely considered to be part of the Star Wars canon for reasons that will be obvious as we progress. Today we go back exactly 3 decades on the 30th anniversary of the release of LucasArts' first foray into the realm of the CD-ROM as we look at Star Wars Rebel Assault. Hello, and welcome to the RETROspective, a series in which I look back at the games of yesteryear that I've played. Today we look back at a specialist subject of mine, Star Wars. In fact, we're taking a look back at the first Star Wars video game that I ever owned. Before Rebel Assault, I had played the LucasFilm Games developed and JVC published Star Wars Episode 4 tie-in game, thanks to a mostly forgotten concept known as the video game rental store. But back when my family got our first Windows PC, my dad got various educational games to throw on it that my sister and I got to play when he wasn't using it for accounting work. However, one of those games wasn't educational in the slightest. That game was Star Wars Rebel Assault. With the hindsight of 30 years, today it's only really noteworthy for being the first LucasArts game on a new medium. To this point, LucasArts games were on a floppy disk, or cartridges for our home console friends. Rebel Assault was LucasArts' first foray into the world of CD-ROM. While we've long since moved past the CD-ROM as a storage medium, 30 years ago, the CD-ROM was a relative novelty. Now, I honestly couldn't tell you when we got our first Windows PC at Casa Unsilent. As far as we were concerned, it was primarily for my dad's work. The tax and accounting programs he used came on these small, round, metallic things called compact discs, or CD-ROMs for short. Back in the early days of the CD, near as I can recall, it was primarily for productivity software and music. I know we now live in an age where this is primarily delivered by digital download or streaming, but this was a technological leap in the early 90s. After all, software was on at least one, but usually multiple 3.5-inch floppy disks, while music was on cassette or vinyl. At a certain point, the move to CDs wasn't going to stop at the latest tax prep software or classic rock albums re-released in a new format. Until 1993, video games had its traditional media that it was stuck on. Other than visiting the local arcade, since we're just racking up old references, let's add that one. You could get games on cartridges to play in your living room at home, or on floppy disks on PC. Sure, well, 1993's most iconic game, Doom, was released on floppy disk. The industry was already pushing beyond that by the time it released. 1993 was the year of the CD system sellers. Not only do home consoles have killer games that move a lot of hardware, but the CD-ROM did as well. However, they were quite a bit different than what we saw from LucasArts. The first released in the spring of 1993. It was a puzzle game called The Seventh Guest. It was actually the third game that I played on the channel. You navigate an old mansion solving puzzles to progress and unlocking story scenes that were full-motion video blue-screened into the game. While the game required hardware beyond what most people had at the time, it was still the top-selling CD game of its era thanks to graphics and audio ahead of anything else at the time, along with critically acclaimed gameplay and atmosphere. Now, it all seems very dated and more of a classic B-movie than a AAA video game, but it was top of the line in 1993. Well, until Doom, but not too many games are Doom. Then fall 1993 saw the release of Myst, similar to The Seventh Guest. This was a puzzle-focused game that allowed you to explore an area and solve puzzles to continue your adventure as you unraveled the history and mystery of the Island of Myst. Unlike The Seventh Guest, Myst was released on Mac. The Windows release wasn't for another 6 months after it came out. The later release might have been for the best, because the Windows market was much bigger than Mac, so there was probably a net benefit to having 6 months of hype, polish, and CD-ROM adoption for the leap from Mac to Windows. When you go back and look at the history of video games on CD-ROM, there are two games that are almost always listed as the ones that got the ball rolling in that regard. They are, as you've probably guessed, The Seventh Guest and Myst. That doesn't mean that they're alone at the forefront of gaming's technological evolution. As you've probably also guessed by the subject of this video, Star Wars Rebel Assault was also pretty influential in CD-ROM gaming. It may be forgotten in the history of the CD-ROM, but it came out 2 months after Myst, and doubled Myst's sales over each of their first 6 months on store shelves. While sales for the first year of Rebel Assault aren't readily available, it took less than 12 months to hit 500,000 units sold, a mark that took The Seventh Guest over a year to reach. And Rebel Assault was a massive shift for LucasArts. It wasn't really until the early 1990s that the game development arm of the Lucasfilm family of companies started developing Star Wars games. The first Star Wars game with Lucasfilm Games' involvement was Star Wars for the NES in 1991. However, that and the subsequent Star Wars movie tie-in games released on the NES and Super NES were all co-developed with other companies. At this time, LucasArts was primarily known for its now legendary point-and-click adventure games with the likes of Monkey Island, Maniac Mansion, and Indiana Jones as cornerstones of the company's interactive ambitions. Their other specialty was the flight combat sim with their focus around World War II aerial combat games. LucasArts' first solo foray into developing a Star Wars game for PC was a spaceflight combat sim in the form of Star Wars X-Wing, released in February 1993. That game puts you in the cockpit of an X-Wing as you battle against the Galactic Empire, including battling their deadly superweapon, the Death Star. Since we've been talking about what format games are released on, X-Wing was originally released on 5 3.5-inch floppy disks, but would get subsequent updates that would put it on CD-ROM. So, despite all this preamble, would it surprise you to find out that Rebel Assault was essentially treated as a tech demo for CD-ROM technology? The concept for Rebel Assault actually came from a small proof of concept by the man who took up the role as project lead. Vince Lee, who had been hired as an Amiga programmer at LucasFilm Games, came into work one day with a 3D rendered Death Star trench run. This little concept became the basis for what became Rebel Assault. After management saw the concept, they decided to greenlight a full version of a game similar to Lee's trench run rendering. Management's only directives were to make a game that ran on CD-ROM and make it Star Wars themed. Did it have to make money? No, actually. There was no expectation that Rebel Assault would turn a profit, just that it would prove the viability of CD-ROM technology for future games. So while the other big CD-ROM games were slower-paced puzzle games, if they were going to make a game in the vein of Lee's concept and make it feel like Star Wars, they'd need to make something a bit faster-paced. For that, Lee went back to a couple of his inspirations as a programmer. Lee was originally brought into Lucasfilm Games as an Amiga programmer. As such, he was fond of games for the Amiga by a company called Cinemaware. Their games combined gameplay and cutscenes as part of the product. It seems pretty standard now to go between game and narrative sequences, but that wasn't always the case in gaming. The other inspiration Lee used was the old Atari-made Star Wars arcade games of the 1980s. These used vector-based graphics to recreate the flight combat sections from Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back, though with a little creative license to make the movie scenes more video game friendly. Rebel Assault looks like it could be a flight sim game at first glance, and especially from the box art that borrows the cockpit style from the X-Wing game, but is actually a rail shooter in the guise of a flying game. Coming hot off the heels of X-Wing, Rebel Assault was a change of pace for the developer. Rather than being a platformer or adventure game like so many LucasArts or Lucasfilm Games titles to that point, this was an action-first title that threw you straight into the action. Well, after an opening cutscene to set the stage for the game. In fact, each level is bookended by a short scene to build up to a level or show the aftermath of what occurred. That's the Cinemaware inspiration coming through early and often in Rebel Assault. And while the first level isn't in the first-person perspective like the arcade games, you do get there for the second level. In fact, there are 4 types of levels in Rebel Assault. 9 of the game's 15 levels are what the game refers to as first-person flight levels. These put you in the cockpit of a starfighter and set you on a strict path to shoot enemies or objects and lean out of the way of solid objects. This is the mode of play most similar to what we know as rail shooters, and most similar to the two vector graphics Star Wars arcade games. The other predominant level type is the third-person flight levels, which comprised 5 of the game's 15 chapters. These give you the view of the rear of your craft as you navigated your way through tight confines and shot targets. There are 2 other level types, overhead third-person bombing and on-foot third-person shooting, but they only feature for 1 level each, so they don't really matter in the grand scheme of the game. Nobody particularly cares for the third-person shooter level, but it's 1 level that isn't even that hard, so it's barely worth acknowledging. Now, you might be wondering where the need for the CD-ROM came in. Well, the game you're looking at is 30 years old. It definitely doesn't look great through 2023 eyes. Through 1993 eyes? Back in the day, the standards for top-of-the-line graphics were much different, but even by those standards, Rebel Assault was at the top of the industry. So how did they achieve that level of graphics? By leveraging the CD-ROM, of course. Rather than having the computer render the levels or cutscenes as one would typically expect, the visuals were largely streamed off of the CD. That's why there's such a visual gap between X-Wing that came out at the start of '93 and Rebel Assault at the end of the year. The technology underpinning video cards and processors didn't make a quantum leap in 9 months. How the hardware available was used did take a leap. The hardware of the time wouldn't have been able to render a game like Rebel Assault at the resolution or frame rate that it was launched at. Even running at 15 frames per second at a resolution likely around 320 by 240, numbers that are positively pedestrian by today's standards. Computers at the time weren't really ready for 3D rendering because video cards with 3D acceleration capability didn't appear to be widely available in 1993. In fact, what my research indicates to be the first mass-produced 3D graphics cards, such as the 3DFX Voodoo and ES3 Verge, didn't reach market until 1995. So to get around the CPU and GPU limitations of the time, the burden fell onto the CD-ROM drive to do the heavy lifting for the game's visuals. Taking a cue from Lee's original rendering, Rebel Assault was predominantly pre-rendered, so the levels are just played back from the CD rather than rendered in real time in reaction to what you do. That's how we ended up with a rail shooter. In each of the levels, save the one on foot mission, players are continuously funneled down a path without the ability to deviate from that. Sure, you can move around on the screen and what you see will shift with it, but you can't make a big deviation from the path the game wants you on. That limits the need to have your computer render big environments or numerous objects at a level of detail that it wouldn't likely be able to handle. So if you get killed on a mission, you're just going to get funneled down the same path, the same way, at the same speed. But hopefully you've learned your lesson because it'll play out the same way unless you change your approach. And you better be able to work your way along the game's rails because you're going to be the hero of the rebellion. We've gotten all this way into talking about how the game was made and how you play it, but what exactly are you playing? As I mentioned off the top, it's not canon. Why? Because Rebel Assault is an alternate universe take on the first 2 Star Wars films. First, the game's intro implies that the Rebel Alliance's first victory over the Galactic Empire was an attack on a Star Destroyer rather than getting most of its fleet decimated above Scarif. Princess Leia is here trying to get the Death Star plans back to the Rebellion, but there's no Luke Skywalker to save the day. Instead, that role is filled by Rookie One, a Tatooine native who has signed up with the Rebel Alliance and is in the right place at the right time to fight the evil Galactic Empire, making the player character an ersatz Luke Skywalker. After going through an intense training regimen, he or she, though the sequel says Rookie One is definitely a he, battles Imperial forces on Tatooine searching for the stolen Death Star plans, before battling probe droids and AT-ATs on Hoth, searching for a hidden Rebel base, and then taking part in the assault on the Death Star above Yavin 4 after it blew up Alderaan. It's a lot of the same key events as episodes 4 and 5, but not in the same order, nor with the same cast of characters. In order to tie the plot and levels together, we have the aforementioned cutscenes to establish events and characters for those unfamiliar with Star Wars, which is probably exceedingly few members of the player base. These scenes involved repurposing scenes from the movies or animating new scenes to fit the plot. Interestingly, while the sequel, Rebel Assault 2, is often given credit as the first live-action Star Wars production after Return of the Jedi, some of the dev staff were filmed as pilots for cutscenes. That credit also given to Rebel Assault 2 also omits Caravan of Courage and Battle for Endor. The disrespect towards legendary Star Wars thespian Wilfred Brimley.
I'm Wilfred Brimley, and I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about diabetes.
For his part, Vince Lee said that he was focused on creating a game that would be fun, rather than being limited by creating a movie or trilogy tie-in game. So while Rebel Assault follows the broad strokes of A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, it's clearly not a direct recreation. After all, there's a lot of the Star Wars movies that happen outside of the cockpit of a starfighter, and Rebel Assault's 9th level proves that those sorts of missions definitely aren't this game's forte. In fact, some of the level design of this game comes back to Lee's inspiration from the Atari arcade games. The levels on Hoth sees rookie ones shooting Imperial probe droids, taking down an Imperial walker, and escaping the planet while destroying TIE fighters. These are all levels that are very much inspired by the Empire Strikes Back arcade game. The Death Star Assault section of Rebel Assault is similar to the Star Wars arcade game with a TIE attack on approach to the space station, a section destroying the space station's turbo laser encampments, and then the trench run. That's 6 of the game's 15 levels that are recreations of levels from the arcade games. 4 of the game's levels are training missions. 2 levels are effectively repeats of training missions, but with TIE fighters to shoot this time. That leaves just 3 other levels that feel like they have their own unique take on the action. There's the level where you take on a Star Destroyer that might be the highlight of the game. You have to disable a special laser cannon on the Death Star in the game's penultimate level. And then there's the sole on-foot level that also includes the odd design choice where you can lose a life by choosing the wrong direction at various forks in the road. While the rail shooter approach has been a point for criticism, especially when you compare Rebel Assault to the then recently released X-Wing and subsequent Space Sim releases, it was far from the only criticism. For a short game, it can be completed in well under 2 hours with the help of a cheat. There are some repetitive levels. The 1st and 5th missions are the exact same run through Beggar's Canyon, and the 11th is similar enough. The 2nd and 6th levels are dodge the asteroids near Tatooine. The 10th and 12th missions are nearly identical but swapping Hoth for Yavin. Really, all the first-person missions have that classic rail shooter mechanic of shoot the enemies before they shoot you as you progress down a fixed path, so they can all feel a little samey. The game's difficulty is incredibly hard to the point where the easy difficulty requires some incredible willpower and repeated attempts to get through if you don't use cheats. I played this on the normal difficulty for the most part, and only got through the first 7 levels before I got to the point where progressing without cheats felt impossible. That's mostly down to the health system. If you don't shoot down a TIE fighter or a turbo laser on time, or didn't dodge something or ran into a solid object, you'd obviously take damage. However, it doesn't take much to destroy your ship. Depending on the difficulty, you'd be looking at something like 5 to 10 hits before you're destroyed. It sounds like a lot, but even on the easy difficulty, it takes considerable effort and skill to stay alive. You do have regenerating health, but it's so glacially slow that most levels would only make it worth 1 hit at best. Games used to be hard, kids. Don't know what to tell you. Maybe pick up a game that came out 20 years before Dark Souls and you'll find out. And then we come to the controls. If you play a console port of Rebel Assault, and we will get to that, the controls are completely different. On PC, though, you have the option of playing with a mouse or a joystick. For some reason, back in the day, we had a joystick, so that's what I always used. The joystick can be pretty sensitive with what feels like no real dead zone. Unlike modern controllers, which come with a standard calibration and dead zone, joysticks didn't have that, so you might still have a slight input even if your hands are off the proverbial wheel. Some of that might be the joystick itself, some of that might be how you configured the joystick's axes when you booted the game. But either way, it didn't feel like you'd always go where you expected, especially on the third-person levels. That's because any little movement would be amplified to the extreme by the game. Don't worry, first-person flying levels don't escape the pain without their own unique foible. For whatever reason, there's a limit on the input that you can make in each frame. Any movement beyond what the game would allow you to do would effectively be buffered and eventually executed until all your inputs are fulfilled. So if you had to make fast and big series of dodges, you might see the game execute that for something like a second or two after you finish moving the joystick. And that was assuming that you could even predict where your crosshairs are going. Having played this game on and off for nearly 30 years meant that I knew what to expect from the controls going in. Combine that with old racing games forcing me to be smooth with my inputs to maximize speed means that I'm probably better prepared than most, and I still found this to be a pain in the ass. This was compounded by the fact the game was on rails. The game has that fixed path that it would put you on, and you had to be ready for what's coming ahead or adapt very quickly. In the third-person flying levels, that generally meant banking hard into whatever turn the game had upcoming, assuming you could tell what was upcoming because depth perception in this game was always a little questionable. In the first-person flying levels, that meant dodging something that you would have otherwise been safe from or changing the direction you were planning to dodge in. And because the developers had already laid these rails long before you played the game, there's no deviation from the path, for better or worse. So if something got you killed and sent you all the way back to the start of a level, hopefully you learned your lessons from your previous run. But all this projects 2023 perspectives on a 1993 game. A game that came out at the bleeding edge of gaming technology. A game that was doing something quite unlike what had been seen before. A game that looked and sounded better than damn near anything that came before it. In 2023, if someone wanted to be punny in titling a review about this game, I would go with a double-meaning attempt and title it Rebel Scum. In the 90s, I thought this was one of the coolest games I'd ever played. It was like being in a Star Wars movie. The NES game was kinda like playing something that was in the Star Wars universe without really being Star Wars. To me, Rebel Assault was a proper Star Wars experience. I was flying an X-Wing, I was flying through an asteroid field, I was shooting TIE fighters and Star Destroyers. This was the greatest thing since sliced bread. If only it wasn't so hard that I couldn't beat it. Of course, that isn't a particularly objective way to review it. Young Steve loved the game. Older Steve still likes it more than a few games I've played on the channel, but it's definitely not in the conversation with sliced bread anymore. The critics were hit and miss on it, too. The general points everyone agreed on were the great graphics and music, but that the gameplay lacked in variety and replayability. How that impacted scores depended on the reviewer, with scoring everywhere between the 40s and the 90s on the various scales from various outlets. And here we are looking back on it 30 years later. It hasn't aged spectacularly, to the point where its impact on gaming and CD-ROM based gaming is overlooked. Despite its commercial success, you won't see Rebel Assault mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Myst or The Seventh Guest. You won't see it mentioned alongside great rail shooters like Star Fox or Panzer Dragoon. The only Star Wars lists it'll show up on are the worst games in the franchise's history. Yet, gamers at the time generally loved it. Time does funny things to certain games. Not every game ages well, and Rebel Assault is unfortunately among the victims of time. There were a couple of other versions of the game released that found their way to home consoles, not to the PlayStation 1. LucasArts had moved on from porting Rebel Assault by the time the PS1 hit store shelves in North America. PlayStation kids would have to wait until the sequel to play Rookie One's adventures. Instead, the Sega CD and 3DO both got ports of Rebel Assault. For those who don't recall, the Sega CD was an attachment to the Sega Genesis. I know that you're thinking that the Genesis, or Mega Drive, depending on what part of the world you're from, definitely didn't seem capable of running Rebel Assault, and you'd be right. The Sega CD came with its own additional CPU and RAM to power the console to be able to run the games that required it. But even with that additional power, Toshi Morita, formerly the manager of new technology at LucasArts, pegged the Sega CD at about 1/4 of the processing power of low-end computers of the time. So the Sega CD version of the game definitely loses a lot in the translation from PC to home console. The lack of hardware power resulted in a game with a limited color palette and low frame rate. And if it wasn't bad enough that you couldn't really see where you're going in the game, LucasArts also had to lose one level when porting the game to Sega CD. On the plus side, though, because you used the D-pad instead of a joystick, the crosshair never recentered itself. That worked surprisingly well for first-person missions where targeting was a priority, but you also suffered from some pretty slow crosshair movement, making tracking fast ships and dodging objects nearly impossible. Conversely, the 3DO actually had enough power to run Rebel Assault. While low-end PC processors could handle about 8 million instructions per second, the 3DOs could handle about 7 million. So while it wasn't as powerful as a home computer, it wasn't as comically far off as the Sega CD. There was a loss of graphical fidelity, sure, but it still ran about as well as the PC original, occasional frame rate hiccup aside. A far cry from Doom, the last 3DO port that I played on the channel, which was an absolute disaster. In terms of playing it, it had the same D-pad pluses and minuses as the Sega CD port, but without the low frame rate to make everything feel worse. Overall, I preferred the PC version, but I could see how some people might prefer to play the 3DO version. The Sega CD version makes me wonder what the port they were thinking. Of course, in both instances, you aren't talking about super popular pieces of hardware. Each sold just over 2 million consoles, while the competing PlayStation 1 sold over 100 million units. Sales figures for the home console releases aren't available, but if Doom on the 3DO sold 10,000 copies, I can't imagine Rebel Assault would be too far off that, which would be a far cry from the millions of PC copies sold. And yes, it did sell millions of copies on PC. The original goal was to sell 15,000 copies, but as pre-release feedback came into LucasArts, expectations increased to 50,000. Even that was beaten by sales, as the first run of the game sold all 100,000 copies within 3 days of launch. Lee attributed that to the lack of Star Wars games on the market, combined with the then amazing audiovisual presentation. The small market of CD-equipped computers wasn't even a limitation for long, because CD drive manufacturers were approaching LucasArts to bundle the game with CD drives. It was a literal system seller for CD drives. And because of that, the sales up to the end of the century was 1.5 million units, or 100 times the original sales goal. And certainly a healthy number more now that the game is available as a digital release on PC. And because it far exceeded expectations, Rookie 1 returned to PCs 2 years later in Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire. The sequel is considered far and away the superior product, except with gaming critics it seems. Since that game's 30th anniversary is just a couple years away, I think we'll circle back to The Hidden Empire at that time. My initial memories of that one, though, is that the final 2 levels really tried to melt the Windows 98 tax machine that I tried running it on, but like I said, we'll come back to it. But until we come back to The Hidden Empire, that will do it for my retrospective on Star Wars Rebel Assault. Did you play Rebel Assault back in the day, or maybe nowadays? Leave your memories in the comments down below. And if you like this look back at Rebel Assault, hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new or looking for more classic game reviews or more classic Star Wars games. Share on social media, follow on social media. My social media handle is UnsilentOnAir, and that is for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And don't forget, Chancellor, Star Wars is our speciality. We've got playlists on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.